Okay, good afternoon, grade 12, and welcome back to 21st Century Literature from the Philippines and the world. And starting this afternoon, we'll start talking about literature from the world. If you still remember, in the first quarter, our focus has been on the literature of our country. Okay, but again, as I've said, starting today, we'll be moving beyond our borders. Okay, just a few reminders before we start our discussion on the different forms of literature from different continents and countries. Just a gentle reminder, especially when we are taking our major exam, the quarterly exam. So please do not copy answers from the internet. And hopefully this will also be applied when you make assignments, when you make performance tests, because this is one thing that I've noticed among my students in the senior high, that with the technology that we have, things have been very kind of available to us. A lot of materials are available to us. And sometimes there's a tendency for us to just copy things from the internet instead of using our minds, our brains in answering our tasks in our exam. And it's a bit sad, but I understand I may not have fully explained the parameters and the rules, but hopefully starting the second quarter, you will try your very best not to copy things from the internet for your assignments, for your performance task, and for your quarterly exams. Now, if the task is about a research work and I explicitly tell you to copy, paste, then you may do so. But unless I tell you those instructions, please make your answers as original as possible. Okay, so this is for our own culture, it's for our own development. Okay, so compared to just copying things, when we construct our own paragraph sentences, okay, we of course use our brain, our minds, and we develop our intellectual capacity that way. Okay, so hopefully you understand my predicament, my point as regards this particular reminder. Okay, that's one thing that I've noticed in the answer. So it's more visible to me now because I have now more students than the previous year. And it so happened that in the things that I've been checking for the past 2 weeks, I'm seeing a lot of similar answers, okay, from students. And that made me ask why why are these things similar? And so I kind of look into possible source that they've been using, and fortunately I found their sources. So that means they are simply copying things from the internet instead of constructing their own answers. Okay, so aside from being kind of a plagiarism, since we are not acknowledging our source, or else our teacher will discover that we just got it from somewhere. Okay, it's also not really kind of productive on our part when we just get things available in the internet. Okay, so I hope I have explained it clearly. So hopefully I will see improvement in the coming quarter. Okay, so after the reminder, let me congratulate our top-notchers for 21st century literature from the Philippines and the world. We have Christian Guerrero, who got 38 out of 40. Okay, so we also have Veronica Evalida, who got 37 out of 40. And Calry Pagkaliwagan who got 36 out of 40 items. Okay, so congratulations to all of you and to the rest of the class who really tried their best in reviewing and preparing for the exam. Don't worry, there's still the second quarter for those who got a bit low in this first quarterly exam. Okay, today we'll be moving on, as I've said, into something beyond our borders. So our lesson for today is focused on the literary genres, traditions, and forms from different national literature and cultures. And to kind of somehow put things in order, we'll be doing it by continent. Okay, so for the first part of our discussion, for this asynchronous part, I'll be covering Asian and African literary cultures. Okay, and then the rest will be tackled in our synchronous class later. Okay, so I'm not anymore giving you a schedule of specific topics because there are sudden changes in our schedule. Okay, so hopefully we'll just be able to cover all the things, the topics that are allotted for the second quarter. Okay, so let's jump in to this lesson number 5. And we start with the competencies. What is our target for this particular lesson? Okay, so that's to identify representative texts and authors from Asia, North America, Europe, Latin America, and Africa. Okay, so as I have said a while ago, for the first half of this class, I'll be focusing more on the Asian and African literary cultures. And I'll be giving specific names, specific authors, and specific works of literature that can kind of represent the literary culture of each of these continents and their respective countries. Okay. So just another reminder that I would like to give. One thing that I also noticed in some of the submissions in the previous quarter is that some of you already submitted materials that belong to other continents or other countries, especially when I ask you to submit an example of a riddle, a folktale, a myth. Okay, so this time when I ask you to do things, it will be for the other countries, okay? Not anymore coming from the Philippines. Okay, that's just another reminder. Okay, let's begin with the closest literary culture to Filipinos, of course, Asian literature. Okay, so again, we'll be kind of selecting a few countries that can represent the literature of the different continents. And of course, for Asia, we have Chinese literature as a very good representative since it is one of the oldest civilizations, the perhaps more influential literary culture compared to other literary cultures. And of course, it is something that is also close to us. Okay, we have this kind of, Philippines has this important and, shall we say, lasting relationship with China. Okay, so I just I just wonder if we really have a clear idea about Chinese literature. But hopefully with this discussion, we will get some idea about their literature. Okay, so let's begin with what they call as Shijing, or the Book of Poetry, and why this particular anthology or collection is so important when we speak of Chinese literature. So the Book of Poetry, China's first anthology, is a collection of 305 poems that date back to a period between approximately 800 and 600 BC. Okay, so if you will look into the culture of the Chinese people, you'll see that it goes back, when speak of literature, in the context of literature, it goes back to a very, very ancient past. Okay, so that means these things that have been collected between 800 to 600 BC were works of people from a very ancient past of China. So imagine between 800 and 600 BC. So that's around 3,000 years from our present time. And they have already started writing poems. Okay, this is a bit, this is really kind of old compared to the literary forms that we have in the Philippines, which may be dated a bit late compared to China. Okay, and this particular poem is also of great import because this book was compiled by no other, no less than Confucius, okay, who lived in the 551 to 479 BC. So when we say anthology, it's a collection, and I love the uh, etymology of the word anthology. It actually comes from two Greek words, anthos, which means flower, and logia, which means collections. It's just a collection of flowers. And it's a beautiful image for literature. Beautiful, fragrant, colorful flower. Okay, but of course, when we speak of literature, the color, the beauty is expressed through the letters, through the words that form that particular work of literature, like a poem. And among the rhetorical devices employed in this book of poetry is the use of metaphor. Okay, so I know you're familiar with metaphor. So it's a figure of speech that describes an object or an action in a way that isn't literally true, but helps explain an idea or make a comparison. Excuse me. Okay, so that's the rhetorical device. So when say rhetorical device, it's a way of convincing people about their message, and to convince people about the content of their poem, they employed metaphors. Okay, so one example, especially in the book of poetry, that they use as a metaphor is the crying ospreys. Okay, ospreys is a kind of a bird, and the cry of the ospreys is compared to the cry of the Lord and Lady during the ancient times. Okay, so that's one way of kind of describing people. Okay, comparing them to the crying ospreys. Now, following the book of poetry, highlights of traditional Chinese literature also included the songs of the South, or Chuchi, then the prose writings in history and philosophy. So they also started writing history, philosophy, especially in the Qin and Han dynasties. Then we have the Tang poetry, the song lyric, and the prose of the Tang and Song dynasty. So one thing that you'll notice in history books, when we kind of talk about the periods in their history, it's usually connected to the name of the dynasty during that particular period. So the Tang and the Song, they are actually name of dynasties. When you say dynasties, they are succession of of rulers coming from one family, from one line, from one single ancestry. Okay. And of course, we also have the short stories, novels, and dramas from the Tang to the Qing dynasties. So what we're seeing based on these details about Chinese literature is that it's so rich. And even in the ancient times, there are a lot of people, a lot of Chinese people who will engage themselves into writing literature. And aside from that, traditional Chinese literature came under the influence of Christianity in the Ming Dynasty. So when you see Ming Dynasty, we're now moving to 1368 to 1644. So it's a bit closer to our present time. And this influence of Christianity happened because of the Western missionaries who made their way to China. And as music is related to poetry, traditional Chinese poetry was inevitably influenced also by the music of the non-Chinese ethnic groups who resided mostly on the Chinese borders. So in general, traditional Chinese literature, though mainly a product of Chinese civilization, has also absorbed in its course of development certain elements from cultures other than the Chinese. And actually, when I was teaching, for example, musical cultures of different countries, what's true about the different cultures is that it's not really totally independent. Okay, we are influenced by other countries or other cultures, so much so that in our musical culture, in our literature, there are elements that we can find that belong to another country. So we have seen that already in the Philippines. For example, when we speak about poetry, we have Filipinos who would write haiku, tanaga. So they are influenced coming from the Japanese. Okay, so that also happened in the Chinese literature. Although they value so much their ancient past, there had been elements that kind of were elements that were integrated also into their culture, outside influences. Okay, so China's literature in the 20th century made a dramatic turn to the West. Okay, so this is something that is kind of a bit surprising, okay, but we see that with the development, with the globalization, okay, China has opened itself to Western literature. And actually, when I applied for ACADSOC, which is a school that teach English to Chinese children, so I all the more I realized how China is kind of opening up itself to English literature. Of course, in some of the materials that we were using, there are things, literary works that are coming from the West. Okay, now to be sure, 20th century Chinese literature has been receptive to the literary works of such Eastern countries as India and Japan, but the presence of the West is quite overwhelming. Okay, so there are a few influences coming from other Asian countries, but again, nowadays there is a big kind of shift of direction towards the West. Okay, now the traditional Chinese literature developed under the intellectual influences of Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism, and even by Christianity in the Ming Dynasty. I've said that a while ago. And the modern period of Chinese literature, which began in the 1910s, is even from multifarious and voluminous. Is even more multifarious and voluminous. We say multifarious, it's many and of various types. And when I say voluminous, it's very lengthy and full. So in short, there are a lot of them. Okay, and Chinese literature in the 20th century made a dramatic turn to the West, as I said a while ago. Okay, now if we will ask for representative writers coming from China, we have Mo Yan. Okay, so they remained, Chinese writers actually remained prolific. They're also excellent in this craft. And though the social impact of literature may be as monumental as it was in the past, the literary tradition of China is still considered as prosperous. Okay? So it did not wane through the years. And notable names would, of course, include Mo Yan, who is a fictionist, and he is an awardee, or he won the 2012 Nobel Prize for Literature. And aside from Mo Yan, we have the remarkable novelists also of like Yu Hua, Wang Shuo, Shi Tisheng, and the stories of Gao Shangsheng, Wang Zhengqi, and Zhang Chenzi. So hopefully I pronounced their names properly. I'm not like a Vice President Duterte, but hopefully I pronounced their names properly. Okay, just to have a taste of one uh, poem from China, we have here a very good example. And as the title tells us, it's about a battle, okay, by Chu Yuan. And this one is translated by Arthur Walley. Okay, so let me just read it. We grasp our battle spears. We don our breastplates of hide. The axles of our chariots touch. Our short swords meet. Standards obscure the sun. The foe roll up like clouds. Arrows fall thick. The warriors pressed forward. They menace our ranks. They break our line. The left-hand tracehorse is dead. The one on the right is smitten. The foal horses block our wheels. They impede the yoke horses. They grasp their jade drumsticks. They beat the sounding drums. Heaven decreased their fall. The dread powers are angry. The warriors are all dead. They lie on the moor field. They issued but shall not enter. They went but shall not return. The plains are flat and wide. The way home is long. Their swords lie beside them. Their blacks bows in their hand. Though their limbs were torn, their hearts could not be repressed. They were more than brave. They were inspired with the spirit of Wu. Steadfast to the end, they could not be daunted. Their bodies were stricken, but their souls have taken immortality. Captains among the ghosts, heroes among the dead. Battle by Chu Yuan. Okay, simply listening to the poem and seeing those descriptive, imagistic words, we can really imagine the state of the soldiers, of the things that we can witness in a battle. Okay, we can see the bravery, the heroism of the soldiers in a battle. Okay. Okay, so after having a taste of the Chinese literature, let's now move on to another country, rich in literature, of course. And I believe that's true in about all countries, but for the sake of example, for our discussion, let's go to Singapore. Anybody here who has been to Singapore? I, for one, has not been there, but I love to go there. I would love to visit this country. Some say that even just visiting the airport will give you already a meaningful, memorable experience of visiting the place. But I haven't had any connecting flight that kind of landed or stopped over Singapore. Okay, because I only travel to Vietnam and Thailand, and there's no need for a connecting flight. But some of my colleagues had this connecting flights, and they said that even just the airport in Singapore is really admirable. But as admirable as their airport is, their rich literature. Okay, so the literature of Singapore comprises a collection of literary works by Singaporeans in any of the country's four main languages. Okay, so most of the write-ups, the works of literature are in the following languages: English, Chinese, Malay, and Tamil. Okay, so with the independence of Singapore in 1965, a new wave of Singapore writing emerged. Poetry is the predominant mode of expression. It has a small but respectable following since independence. Excuse me. And most published works of Singapore writing in English have been in poetry. The poetry of this younger generation is often politically aware, transnational, and cosmopolitan. Okay, so those are very important adjectives, descriptors to remember when we speak about the poetry of the present day Singapore. They are politically aware. Of course, there are political underpinnings. When someone writes poetry, it kind of connotes something that has something to do with their politics. And then transnational, so that means crossing different nations, and cosmopolitan, including or containing people from many different countries. Okay, so there are different cultures residing in Singapore, and that kind of uh, how do you say that, cosmopolitan tendency, okay, or the character of having people from different countries really contribute to the colorful expression that they now have in their poetry. Okay, of course, with different cultures coming together, we can expect more of a marriage between two or among many cultures, and that would be also expressed in their literature. Now, if you're going to have a good kind of representative author from Singapore, okay, we can name Goh Po Seng. Okay, he is one of the celebrated authors of Singapore. He was born actually in Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia. Then he was educated at the Victoria Institution in Kuala Lumpur. He went to study medicine in the University of Dublin. Okay. Then he discovered his passion for writing and even took a year off school to write. So some of writers do that. They kind of stop from working for a year. I know someone who did this. Okay, and they a lot and spend that year in writing. Okay, and then after graduating with a medical degree, he returned to Singapore in 1961 and practiced medicine for 25 years. So you can see the kind of colorful background of Goh Po Seng. He is a medical practitioner, he's a doctor, but he turned into a famous writer and advocate of literature of Singapore, although he was born in Malaysia. Okay, and Goh's contribution to the local arts scene cannot be understated. He was one of the pioneering Singaporean writers who attempted to define post-independent Singaporean literature. So just like other countries, Singapore has been colonized, and independence is a catalyst, is a kind of a trigger for literature. Okay, so we know we have that here in the Philippines. For example, when we're colonized by the Americans, a lot of things have been written that has something to do with independence, especially during the time of our national heroes. Okay, now Goh formed his own publishing company, the Island Press, and founded also literary magazine Tumasek. He also co-founded Century 65, which is Singapore's first multidisciplinary arts center. They were the kind of hone or train beginning or promising writers. He also chaired the National Theatre Trust and was the vice chairman of the Arts Council from 1967 till 1973. Now, in 1986, he decided to immigrate to Vancouver, Canada with his family, a decision influenced by his disillusionment with the state of Singaporean cultural politics at the time. We say disillusionment, it's a feeling of disappointment because maybe he's not getting what he expects from the government. Okay. And he worked as an outpost doctor in Newfoundland, returning to practice in Vancouver after receiving his Canadian medical license. And he did not return anymore to Singapore ever since his self-imposed exile. So he left Singapore. And in 1995, Goh was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, which forced him to retire from practice. And since then, he started to write full-time and was able to produce 2 collections of poetry and novels, as well as some volumes of a loosely based fictionalized autobiography. Okay, so one of his works that is not considered as a classic is The Immolation. Okay, remember the name Goh Po Seng. Another important writer from Singapore is Catherine Lim, and she is known for her short stories. Okay, and one of them is the Taximan's Story, okay, which will be your reading assignment for this lesson. Okay, so I will attach a copy of this short story. Okay, but of course, together with a reading assignment will be a few questions that you will have to answer after reading it. Okay, so she was born in March 21, 1942, also at in Malaysia. She has published 9 collections of short stories, 5 novels, and 2 poetry collections, and numerous political commentaries to date. But she is considered more as a writer coming from Singapore. Okay. So this particular story, the Taximan story, will be an interesting reading material for you, and hopefully you can somehow see similar issues between the Philippines and Singapore. Okay, so don't worry, it's just you'll have to answer easy questions that are related to the said story. Okay, we now move on to another literary culture, okay, which is a Japanese literature. Okay, so Japanese literature has been influenced heavily by the Chinese literature from the ancient period all the way to the Edo period. Okay, so just like in China, we kind of classify the periods by the name of the rulers. Okay, like the Edo period, and of course, the Edo period corresponds to the early modern Japanese literature. Okay, so when you say modern Japanese literature, it is in contradistinction with the ancient Japanese literature. Japanese literary works also reveal elements of Indian and later of Western elements, but above all, they reveal a distinct style, which has also greatly influenced both Eastern and Western literature. So what we are saying is that there is an exchange among different literary cultures. We get some, we give some elements, okay, and we integrate those elements into our own respective literary cultures. Now, when we speak of Japanese literary culture, one of the things that we can remember are the 4 kind of periods in their literary history. Okay, so we have the ancient, classical, the medieval, and the modern literature. Okay, so we have here on our slide the focus and some of the important representatives coming from those periods in the literary history of Japan. So when we speak of ancient literature in Japan, it deals more with myths and legends, of course, tales like the creation of Japan, wherein the islands came from the gemstone imbued in the swords of gods, and very prominent during this period. So that's how they kind of tell the story about creation coming from Japan, coming from the gemstones imbued in the sword of the gods. Okay, and the celebrated writers during this period are Ono Yasumaro, Nihon Shoki, and Manyoshu, who wrote based on real events in the country. And then for the classical period, so that's a bit later than the ancient period, it occurred during the Golden Age or the Heian period. So you will encounter in history books that particular name of a period, the Heian period, and that's considered to be the golden age of Japan. It's where a lot of development or flourishing of the culture happened. So during this period, Murasaki Shikibu, one of the greatest Japanese writers, wrote the seminal text Tale of Genji. Okay, it's considered as the first novel, the world's first novel. So remember the name, Murasaki, it's Shikibu. And then, of course, it's a very charming and accurate depiction of the Japanese court during the Heian period under the reign of Empress Akiko. Okay, as for the medieval, okay, what happened here is the intertwining, okay, of history and literature. So history and literature kind of merged together. And this is primarily because of the influence of the civil wars happening and the emergence of the warrior class. So perhaps in some movies we have encountered this warrior class in Japanese history, the shoguns, the samurais. Okay, so thus war tales are very prominent during this period. Besides war stories and tales, the popular form of Japanese poetry, the renga, saw its rise. Okay, so it's also good to remember that name, okay, renga. Now, as for the modern literature, it can be further divided into early modern and modern. Okay, but let's just take it as modern period. Okay, again, this one happened in the Edo period and started during the Meiji period when Japan opened its doors to the West. And so we can expect that with the opening of Japan to other cultures, there will be again new elements that will be integrated into their own culture. So the early modern gave way to the rise of new genres like the Japanese drama, the kabuki, okay, wherein of course you have actors, we have a bit of music also, we have mask, we have face painting, we have drama. Okay, the poetry form known for its simplicity and subtlety called haiku, and the yomihon are a type of Japanese book which put little emphasis on illustration. Okay, so those are just a few of the genres that kind of surfaced or started to flourish during the modern period of Japanese literature. Okay, one of the representatives will be Haruki Murakami. Okay, and his work, The Boy Named Crow. Okay, so I have also attached this short story in your handout. So if you have time, if you have the luxury of time to read, or maybe in the coming vacation, okay, you can somehow have a taste of Murakami's work. Okay, so again, the modern period marked the emergence of new styles of writing and Japanese writers started to romanticize and tried experimenting with different genres and subject matters. The Second World War, as we know, heavily affected Japan and also its literature. Okay, but the distinct Japanese style of writing managed to regain its popularity. Some of the prominent modern Japanese writers are Yasunari Kawabata, Kobe Abe, Takiji Kobayashi, and Haruki Murakami, just to mention a few. Okay, so again, if you would like to have a taste of Japanese literature, I have attached The Boy Named Crow in your handouts, and see the creative mind also coming from a Japanese writer, Japanese point of view. Okay, we're done with the Asian culture. We now move on to African literary culture. Okay, anybody here who has been to Africa or very familiar with African literature? So what do we expect when we hear the term African literature? Okay, maybe one of the things that can pop up our mind are the struggles of the Black members of our of the world. But aside from that, of course, there are many other issues that their literary works touched on. Okay, so when we speak of African literature, the development of this particular literary culture developed from the oral tradition up to the current trends. And they reflect the people's history, their feelings and minds of its population. So the Dark Continent enjoys a vast collection of masterpieces, both in oral and written literature, which are highly diverse and at the same time common. The Negritude movement in 1934 opened the avenue for writers to celebrate what is truly African. Now, the writings on Africa started in the Middle Ages, actually, when Arabic was introduced to them. And then it moved forward in the 1800s with the coming of the alphabet and with the birth of what we say, negritude. Okay, so that literally means actually blackness, and that somehow talks about the complexion, their skin complexion. But with that is colorful history, colorful stories behind them. And of course, African writers are very much committed to speak about, to share about their culture, their traditions, and values that can be applied in the modern world. Actually, from time to time, if we are watching American films, especially the touch on history, there will be elements coming and taken from African culture. The drive of writers to write and excite political freedom grew, and the dignity of African traditions has been asserted. The Negritude movement, again, as I've said, kind of opened up avenues or ways for the Negritude to celebrate their own culture instead of putting down, looking down on their culture, in their skin color, in their tradition. With the movement, they are able to celebrate it, to see the brighter side of their literary cultures. So some representatives, okay, one representative of the African literature will be Chinua Achebe, a Nigerian novelist, poet, and writer who is regarded as the dominant figure of modern African literature. Okay, so other representative writers are Wole Soyinka, Kofi Awunur, Ngojiwa Thiong'o, Okot Bitek, Dennis Krutus, Eskia Fahlele, Nadine Gordimer, and Jacques Rabemananjara, okay, who wrote in European language. Okay, but still they kind of embody, they still represent the spirit of African nationalism. So these names may not be so familiar to us, but in other parts of the world, these works have gained a worldwide acclaim. They have been very famous in other countries. Okay, another representative from the African culture, literary culture, is V.Y. Mudimbe. Okay, in the aftermath of the colonial experience, African writers have since chronicled new challenges that have emerged in their respective societies. And new sovereign governments may have been installed, but their own problems caused writers to react. And that's one thing that great writers do. They kind of react to the changes, to the maybe abuses that the people are experiencing in their contemporary era. Okay, so this was evident, especially in the case of Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who was imprisoned for a play considered to have subversive messages against the Kenyan administration of the time. Okay, so that happens from time to time to writers. They would be abducted, they would be jailed simply because of the message of their works. Now, corruption in society, long-standing theme of African writers in post-colonial times, was reflected in Mudimbe's Before the Birth of the Moon. Okay, so this is a nice reading material, although I do not have it in your handouts. You may want to search in the internet if there's an available kind of a full text of this. Okay, so Before the Birth of the Moon. So even before the colonizers arrived in Africa and indelibly shaped the continent's identity, local traditions were already flourishing in terms of cultural wealth. So we can, of course, kind of decipher their rich culture even in their myth or in their other folk tales. Okay, so that much I would like to talk about for the first period for this synchronous part. So just wait for a while for the link that I'll be sharing so that we can continue with the other continents and the representative literary cultures. Okay, see you later.